Hello, everyone. It is my immense pleasure and privilege to introduce David Kaye, the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression, and Professor of Law at the University of California at Irvine. The Special Rapporteurs, as special procedures mechanisms of the Human Rights Council, stand at the very center of the galaxy of institutions and bodies that make up the international human rights system, and have been described as catalysts of rights, determinants of influence, the jewels in the crown of the UN human rights system. The Special Rapporteurship on Freedom of Opinion and Expression is one of the oldest, having been established in 1993 by the old Commission on Human Rights. The Special Rapporteur is mandated to, amongst other things, gather all relevant information relating to violations of the right to freedom of opinion and expression wherever they occur, to seek, receive, and respond to credible and reliable information from governments, NGOs, and other parties in this regard, and to make recommendations and provide suggestions on ways and means to better promote and protect this right. And the mandate is also amongst the most controversial and challenging of mandates of the Human Rights Council, as it necessarily deals with some of the most difficult and divisive human rights issues that challenge and perplex our world. Issues from impunity for the killings of journalists, to blasphemy laws, to national security policies and the power of corporations in the digital age. Issues that we here at CEU discuss in our classes and courses in legal studies and in the School of Public Policy, confront through our engagement in projects at the Center for Media, Data and Society, and debate at the level of the university. CEU is an institution whose uniqueness rests in its dedication to socially and morally responsible intellectual inquiry, its open society mission and commitment to building open and democratic societies that respect human rights, all of which depend on the effective exercise of freedom of opinion and expression. As Special Rapporteur, David Kaye has so far produced detailed reports to the Human Rights Council on the use of encryption and anonymity in the exercise of the rights to freedom of opinion and expression in the digital age, and on freedom of expression and the private sector, a report which was released just yesterday in advance of the Council's 32nd session beginning next week. And he has also reported to the General Assembly on the protection of whistleblowers and sources. In addition, he has conducted country visits to Tajikistan and Japan. Through his work, David has been remarkably open and transparent in engaging in meaningful consultation with NGOs and other stakeholders. He has been a leading light in the global movement of freedom of expression, providing detailed recommendations and policy guidance to states and non-state actors, notably the private sector, but also civil society and international organizations, on the implementation of international human rights law, specifically under Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Although David has visited Budapest before, I'm deeply honored to welcome him as our guest to deliver his first, but hopefully not his last, public address as Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression. Please join me in welcoming David to CEU.
Sejal, thank you so much. Thanks to you and to Ava and everyone at CEU who really welcomed me here. It's really a delight to be here. I also want to acknowledge Judge Richard Goldstone and Dunja Mijatovic in the audience, two people whose work has really shaped the way I see international criminal law and freedom of the media. And so I think the pressure's on a little bit as well. But I'm really grateful that you're here. So I prepared some remarks. Hopefully it won't be too long and test your patience. But I think there are several issues that I want to address today. And I think we'll have time at the end for substantial Q&A and discussion over the issues that I'll address. So in a major cover story this week, The Economist, the British magazine that has this omniscient voice, warns that the freedom of expression is in retreat. I think this is a modest conclusion. Rather than mere retreat, we are witness, I believe, to the greatest multi-front assault on freedom of expression since Mikhail Gorbachev introduced glasnost in the 1980s and began to roll back censorship in the Soviet Union more than 30 years ago. Authoritarianism, dogmatic and militant religious belief, terrorism and counter-extremism policies, online misogyny and propaganda, oligarchy and corruption, legal regulations and extra-legal intimidation, the desire for power and control of information. The factors behind this assault are expanding, and all the while individuals face threats, harassment, imprisonment, torture, and even murder for expressing their opinions. These are journalists, artists, filmmakers, writers, regular citizens who face attack for what they share. Billions more suffer under vast systems of censorship, intimidated into silence, or denied access to information. I'm thinking about people like LGBT activists in Russia and Kyrgyzstan who are banned from discussing sexual identity, of Baha'i in Iran who cannot teach their children the basics of their heritage, countless others denied access to information because of attacks on the media through tools like criminal defamation lawsuits, to the takedowns of social media posts that, quote unquote, insult political leaders. In too many countries, a dissenting post can land somebody in prison unless the social media company, itself a censor today, takes it down first. Even in free societies, the threat of terrorism has led governments to adopt tools that chill expression and censor broad swaths of legitimate speech in the name of countering extremism. Evidence also suggests that around the world, people young and old are increasingly attracted to laws and regulations that limit what people can say. So for those who believe that freedom of expression is essential not only to democratic governance and accountability, but individual self-development, we face two kinds of challenges. The first, how committed are we, those who enjoy the protection of human rights law, to freedom of expression? In the face of deep offense and intimidation brought about by the speech of others, how do we come to appreciate the value of freedom of expression, and how do we share that value with others? The second set of challenges is specific and driven by law and policy. What are the specific threats to freedom of expression? And what tools are necessary to protect against them? How do those tools vary according to the nature of the different challenges? So I'll begin with the first challenge, the broader fundamental question of the values that I think are at stake and that we need to advocate, and then I'll address the second set of more specific challenges. International human rights law imposes binding obligations on all states. I think everybody knows that. And under that law, found in Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, everyone enjoys the right to hold an opinion without interference, and the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, and through any media. The law only permits restrictions on expression, never on the holding of opinion. Opinion is not subject to any restriction. But those restrictions on expression may only be permitted when they're provided by law and when they're necessary to protect a specific interest, such as national security, public order, or the rights of others. One of the keys to reviving the global commitment to freedom of expression, I think, is to emphasize each element of Article 19 in the context of individual lived experience. In instances where expression offends us, I think our first human reaction is often to want to silence it. That's human. That's normal. But it's not a power that I have as an individual. I can tune it out, but I can't silence it. Right? I can tune out your speech, but I can't silence you. But that's often not enough of a response around the world today. So I suggest we turn the situation and ask ourselves and encourage people to ask themselves, do I hold an opinion? Do I have opinions that others may find offensive? And of course, the answer is always going to be yes. We all, much as we think our opinions are unassailable, we all hold opinions that others find offensive. So do I want a public authority to interfere with that opinion, with my ability to hold opinions? Do I want a private actor to enjoy that power? Of course, part of this exercise of asking ourselves what we would accept and what others should accept is about recognizing our own limitations and also respecting that others do not always share our beliefs. Similarly, in thinking about expression, people are often too willing to shrug when a journalist is harassed for pursuing a sensitive story that might implicate national interest or national security, or they shrug when a whistleblower faces retaliation for exposing waste, fraud, or abuse. People seem willing, and polls actually suggest this, people seem willing to accept censorship when it is presented as protection of a national interest or a cultural value or some other norm. But here again, let's make it personal, and let's encourage others to make it personal. What are the facts and ideas that I need to have access to in order to make decisions about my own life, about my identity, about my belief, whether it's religious or something else, about my political affiliations and the votes I want to cast as a citizen? What will make me better equipped to make these decisions? Filtered and sanitized information, or a broader range of information and ideas? That's a loaded way to put it, of course. Ultimately, censorship and its cousin propaganda, for it's propaganda that drowns out and casts doubt upon facts and ideas, as my colleague Dunya Mijatovic in the OSCE has demonstrated time and again. These deny us the right of public participation and in shaping our own destinies and our own values. So Article 19 is not meant merely to protect a particular person's right to impart information. It's not meant merely to protect the journalist who's reporting and sharing information, or the whistleblower who's calling out waste, fraud, and abuse. Article 19 is also about protecting everyone's right to seek and receive information so that we can all be full participants in the life of our communities and fully developed as human beings, as grandiose as that may sound. Okay, so if the first task is to revive a kind of global commitment to freedom of expression, a global commitment to the ideas behind Article 19, I think it's also crucial to address specific challenges. And while I could easily name many more, I'm going to limit myself to 4 so that afterwards we have enough time to actually talk about them and talk about other challenges that you might see around the world. So I'll identify these 4 major threats that I think deserve close attention. So 1, basic oppression of members of vulnerable communities. So around the world, those seeking to express themselves face a variety of threats. Those include surveillance, arrest, prosecution, and killing. They face threats of prosecution for blasphemy and defamation. They're disappeared for books they published, or slaughtered for opinions they've adopted. They're forced underground for expressing what individuals, or for expressing what governments or certain sectors of society think should not be expressed. Individuals, civil society, and unpopular and vulnerable minorities need more than ever the support of the international community. They need the affirmation that these rights matter. They need states to use their political and economic muscle in favor of freedom of expression, and they need the moral support, the legal commitment, and the practical example of the UN system. So that's 1, the threats to vulnerable communities. 2, threats to free and independent media. So everywhere we look, there's consolidation of media ownership, certainly here, but around the world. And with it, there's a cozy relationship between the media and the government, undermining basic skepticism that should be understood as being at the heart of independent journalism. And here's a problem with that. The vast majority of people get their information from the mass media, right, from the large media outlets around the world. which are increasingly owned by the mega wealthy whose interests are shared with the government. The government may allow small media outlets to exist, giving them the opportunity to proclaim a commitment to freedom of expression. And yet those media outlets lack the resources to reach a broader audience, to the delight of the government, right? So they can have it both ways, both this cozy relationship with the media and the idea, right, that they're allowing freedom of expression. And yet people generally in these kinds of situations simply don't have access to the full range of information that should be available to them. So we need to find ways to support independent media and also confront and call out the mass media's connection to government, which itself is a form of corruption. Meanwhile, quite apart from that, we see governments insisting on a definition of who qualifies as a journalist. And it's a definition that's woefully out of step with the times, one that excludes citizen journalists, human rights NGOs, which very often are performing the same functions as journalists, bloggers, even academics. These are all excluded from the basic protections of what journalists enjoy. We see these groups as targets, such as sources and whistleblowers, in ways that undermine access to information and basic democratic principles. More than ever, we need to support independent media, the investigative work of journalism, and its ever-growing role in imparting information online. Third is the growing censorship and abuse of the internet, so the abuse of digital rights. The Human Rights Council in the UN and the General Assembly have repeated the principle that offline rights apply online. It's become a mantra, right? What's allowed, what's permitted offline applies online as well. The rights are the same. But while we once discussed the internet, perhaps in its early days, as the new frontier for freedom of expression, as a kind of great democratizer of speech and access to information, discussion today focuses on the internet as a threat. Governments are often talking about the internet as a threat, as a terrorist recruitment tool, a haven for offensive behavior, a forum for incitement. This perception, I think, has led to an unprecedented level of censorship, restriction, and surveillance, threatening the very survival of the greatest tool for access to information that the world has ever known, which is really what the internet is. As a result, online censorship has become increasingly sophisticated and pervasive, filtering, throttling, and slowing down our access to the internet, even shutting down internet services to keep unwanted information from citizens. These are contemporary tools of censorship. We see them in too many states to mention here, although in the Q&A we can talk about specific examples. We also too often rely on corporate actors to decide what to censor, undermining public accountability and transparency. In turn, the internet is becoming a place for a lot of people of great insecurity and mistrust as governments devote themselves to mass surveillance of online spaces, undermine tools such as encryption and anonymity. They arrest people for their social media posts or put them under suspicion for their search histories. In fact, just yesterday, the director of the FBI was talking about enjoying a kind of right to access search histories without a warrant. Proposals in the United Kingdom and the United States and new laws in France raise concerns on their own for what they say about the future of online freedom and security, but also the message they send to the non-democratic states around the world that are all too eager to use these tools to undermine freedom of expression. The fourth threat and final threat that I'll mention is the increasing use of national security and public order as rationales to restrict expression. A catch-all for censorship and repression today is the fight against extremism. But extremism itself is not a legal concept. It is rather an elastic concept that provides governments around the world the ability to restrict expression without proving necessity and proportionality, fundamental elements of Article 19. For every restriction grounded on the threat of extremism, we need a chorus of respondents saying, show us why this is necessary, why other less invasive tools of security or strategies to maintain stability are unavailable, how it is proportionate, and so forth. The mere incantation of extremism or national security must be challenged at every opportunity unless it will swallow whole the rights that we enjoy. So I want to close on a practical note, because this is a pretty dim view of the situation for freedom of expression. I acknowledge that. And if you have a more optimistic view, please share it afterwards. Even I could be cheered up sometimes. But at the end of the day, I'm an optimist. I believe strongly that the human rights to freedom of opinion and expression are essential to our status as sentient beings. Again, grandiose, but I think true. And I also believe that the law and history are actually on the side of freedom of expression. We're not really at a new place in many ways, because every generation going back in history, certainly since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, has thrown up obstacles to freedom of expression. This isn't, in particular, a new phase for us. It's a different phase, and the internet changes our ability to express ourselves and the ability of governments to surveil, but fundamentally, it's similar to the past. Repeatedly, the tools of law and public advocacy have been brought to bear to resist restrictions on expression. And I would use just one example from very recent experience, and that's the release of Khadija Ismailova from Azerbaijan just a couple of weeks ago. So Khadija is a journalist and an activist who ran afoul, right, of the president of Azerbaijan because of her reporting on corruption. And she spent several years facing harassment and intimidation, and finally was arrested on pretext charges and sent to prison for 7.5 years, I think was her sentence. And it really took a widespread use of different tools of advocacy to gain her release, whether it was Dunya and the OSCE, or the Council of Europe, or individual lawyers and NGOs advocating on her behalf, and increasingly putting pressure on Azerbaijan to release her. These were different tools of both advocacy, legal and political, that together worked to gain her release. And I think that's a kind of optimism, that we do have these tools and that these tools can work. And I would take it further and say that in national courts, in regional human rights bodies, in the international treaty bodies, we have examples of committed advocates standing up on principle. This is a long-term and persistent battle for freedom of expression, and I'm confident that if we use the tools that are provided by law, if we use the institutions that are provided by law, freedom of expression ultimately will win out. So with that, I'll conclude. I hope we have an opportunity for some robust discussion. If you want to challenge my optimism at the end, or tell me another reason why I should be down, I really look forward to it. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, David. That was a really inspiring and thoughtful lecture. We have ample time for comments and questions, reflections from you, and engagement. So please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. And in doing so, it would be wonderful if you could introduce or identify yourself. Okay, Peter, yeah.
Thank you. I'm Peter Molnar, and I'm a free speech scholar here at CU. And two questions about to what extent you think, David, it's possible to promote sort of broadly free speech protective measures regardless of the context in all sorts of countries. Two examples. In the United States, famously, legal approach has been developed to so-called hate speech, that it's part of freedom of speech and it's only prohibited when it creates imminent danger. Do you think that's applicable elsewhere? Would you promote that elsewhere? And if so, with what concept? And the second is about access to information. Would you agree with the strong whistleblower protection that provides that if someone leaks classified information, that person should go unpunished if the courts would say in her or his case that there was no stronger public interest in holding the information classified than the public interest is in having it public? Mm-hmm. So would you agree with such a public interest test, or we would say that that would be too dangerous because it would make public officials and others second guess about the whole classification system? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Peter. So on the first question, I think we should be looking first at international standards, and national standards may vary as long as they meet the minimum of the international standard of Article 19. And I don't think that the US First Amendment jurisprudence necessarily helps all the way. I mean, interestingly, I think many people think of the American First Amendment as being a kind of absolutist protection of freedom of expression. It's not. Of course, time, place, and manner restrictions are permitted under the First Amendment. And you have this rule that you mentioned on clear and present danger, which is somewhat different from, as it's developed over time, different from standards for incitement to hatred and violence that you find that are rooted in Article 20 of the ICCPR, for example. So, I think there's quite a bit to learn comparatively from how different countries approach freedom of expression issues. But I don't think that a legal culture is necessarily capable of being, adopted in one country, or one that comes from one country can't necessarily be planted in another. And that it's important for states, as long as they're meeting the fundamental standards under Article 19, to find their ways through their own legal system and their own structure to adopt and implement those norms. So I don't think, like, if we're asking just about clear and present danger, in some places it'll work, in some places it won't be the appropriate standard, frankly. On the issue of whistleblower protection, so I wrote a whole report on this for the General Assembly last fall, and I think as you look around the world, whistleblowers are just repeatedly demonized for calling out waste, fraud, and abuse, legal violations, you name it, right? And there's a perception, I think, among many communities that whistleblowers are traitors. And I think it's important to recognize that there's really no whistleblower out there who wakes up one morning and says, I want to ruin my career. I want to destroy my life and my family's life. That's not how it begins. Usually a whistleblower who actually has some kind of fortitude identifies some wrongdoing in her or his organization and calls it out, sometimes going initially within one's organization, and sometimes when that fails, as it unfortunately often does, going outside of their organization. And it's at that point that organizations tend to rally around, members of organizations tend to rally around the organization, and that's when the demonization of the whistleblower occurs. And I think you need to have very clear rules that protect whistleblowers against retaliation, particularly whistleblowers who are engaging in public interest whistleblowing. And that standard, the one you identified, is clearly the standard. It's certainly a standard in the Convention Against Corruption, for example, but it should be the broader standard across the board. Whether we're talking about the hard cases like national security and intelligence, or other cases that we might see in government or in the corporate sector. Unfortunately, in many places you don't have that public interest exception. I also think on the issue of classified information, governments are really over-classifying, and it's increasing. So whether this is in the United States, where there's kind of rampant classification, notwithstanding the fact that President Obama, when he started, announced that he would try to reduce that, it still exists. And it's continuing in other places, it's growing. In Japan, for example, there was adoption just a couple of years ago of what's known as the Specially Designated Secrets Act, which is increasing the amount of information that is being classified and being held from public view, and at the same time criminalizing those who expose wrongdoing if it's exposing information that's been classified. So I think that you have several things going on there. One is lack of protections for whistleblowers at the same time that you have increase in expansion of classification authority. And those things are really together reducing access to information around the world in democratic environments and in non-democratic ones.
And if I might add, just in response to those 2 points, when it comes to Article 20, we now have, of course, the Rabat Plan of Action, which gives specific guidance in terms of law and policy to states on the interpretation of incitement. And in terms of this region, there is strong jurisprudence on the protection of whistleblowers, making disclosures in the public interest, as many of you know here. All right, so back to the floor. There was a question at the back there. Yes, Kate.
Hi, thank you for that. I just wanted to pick up on one of the themes you were talking about, 2 different themes, and maybe ask you to connect them a little more. One, broadly, the question about intermediaries and the role of social media companies as gatekeepers of so much information, and the relationship between the companies and the governments, especially when it comes to both the issues of protections of privacy and surveillance, which I know you've written really eloquently about, but in particular in the face of all the pressure from governments for the companies to do more, right, to address this, again, broad body of extremism. In particular, one of the things we saw right after the attacks in Paris was the French government passed some very regressive legislation that they've been trying to for years, but were able to within that kind of window because of the anxiety. So I just wanted to ask if you would say more about that, about what can we do in that space, because I think a lot of our mechanisms are set up to help us deal with responding to states and state abuses of power, but how do we transfer those or come up with new ways to deal with the company side? And then related in particular, the body of human rights law and these efforts like the Ruggie principles to try and enforce or encourage, I'm not sure which is the best language, these kind of human rights obligations to be taken up by the private sector. Thank you.
Right. So thanks for the question, Kate. It's so actually just yesterday we released a report that's a kind of mapping report looking at all the different private actors that implicate freedom of expression in a digital age. And I think Kate used the term intermediaries, right? These are companies that are really mediating our ability to exercise the freedom of expression, and they run a huge spectrum, right? From the ones that are most common, the ones that we use every day, like social media companies that are really public. They're owning public, what we think of as public space, but it's really private space, and they're acting as censors, all the way to internet service providers and the telecom industry, telcos that are involved in shutting down services and platforms sometimes on their own initiative, but mostly at the demand of governments. And then you have other actors like the surveillance industry, sharing, selling malware and hardware to governments who then in turn use those tools in order to surveil their own people. So I think there are a few questions embedded in your question. So one is, what specifically are those threats? What are the threats that governments are deploying in order to get the private sector to do its bidding and to act as a censor and to restrict freedom of expression? I think the way governments behave, I would just identify two in particular that are particularly concerning. So one is, and this is a combination of a threat that I think is made even stronger by the lack of transparency on these issues. So the first one is terms of service enforcement, right? So I'm sure when you all have signed up for a different social media account, before you do it, you read carefully the terms of service, right? So those terms of service, or as Facebook calls them, there's terms of service, but also community standards. Those terms of service actually don't, by and large, align with Article 19 rights to freedom of expression, right? Those are more designed towards, the creation of a kind of community that these companies think they're trying to foster. Although I would question whether if your community is, over 1 billion members, whether those standards are community or they should be rooted in something more like human rights. But right now, those are not completely transparent. It's not transparent how social media companies themselves apply those terms of service. And the situation is made worse by the fact that governments are increasingly going to social media companies and saying, enforce your terms of service. So take down, quote unquote, extremist content. Take down, this offensive content. And this, varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction as to what a government thinks is offensive or extremist. But they're essentially telling social media companies, apply your terms of service. And they're doing this even though they themselves, the governments, couldn't legally censor that material. Right, so they want social media to do it on their behalf. So that's, I think, one growing problem, and it's a problem that is in a way new to the digital age, right? It's very specific to social media. The other area that I would just mention, apart from terms of service, where there's serious risks, I actually mentioned two other areas. One is digital security. This was obviously a huge issue in the Apple FBI litigation, aborted litigation earlier this year, where I think fundamentally the government in the United States, or the FBI, is seeking to restrict a particular tool of digital security, namely encryption. Anonymity didn't even come up in that context, but anonymity is one of those things that's persistently under threat. So I think governments are increasingly attacking this issue of our own digital security, and they're doing it on the basis of security, when in fact our own digital security, our own, the security of our private data depends upon tools like encryption. This is something that I think we need to resist really quite strongly. Encryption is one of those issues that, it's math, and this is a kind of a social science institution, so many of us might, speaking on behalf of myself only, getting too much into the weeds of it might, bore me, but encryption is actually an essential tool for our security, and governments are really, I think, going around public policy and trying to have conversations directly, they call them conversations, directly with, big social media and other internet companies to try to get them to provide backdoors, to undermine digital security. And I think this is a really big problem. And the third issue that I would mention is intermediary liability in a legal context, right? So to what extent should intermediaries be held liable for third-party content? And this is something that's been developing over the last decade, really. And the European Court of Human Rights in the Delphi case, I think, frankly, came out the wrong way on this. And I think the risk is that to the extent that liability is put on third parties, we're going to see the loss of some major forums for expression and communication, whether they're comments, comment streams at news portals, or simply, the posting and our ability and willingness to post on social media, I think is going to deteriorate over time if social media is held liable, if intermediaries are held liable for that kind of content. So there's a variety of threats out there, and I think they're very serious. So you asked the question, Kate, and you're behind a column, so I can't see you, but you asked the question, sort of what can we do in the face of that? I mean, I think, how we deal with social media is, I think, one, is to encourage transparency, because it's very difficult for us to resist social media policies if we don't really know how they're being enforced. But there's a huge amount that's going on that we don't know about. So one is clearly transparency. And then the second is really something that, this project that we're launching with the report that we issued yesterday is going to look at, which is, to what extent should human rights standards really apply to intermediaries when they're exercising essentially public functions. They're exercising the role of censor, of mediator, and so forth. I don't think it's as clear-cut that across the board human rights standards should apply. Some communities online deserve to have their own standards that aren't necessarily human rights standards. But where we draw the line, I think, is exceptionally difficult. And I think we as, as human rights advocates and as those of us who are thinking, not just as advocates, but trying to understand what law is appropriate to best expand freedom of expression and protect and promote it, we really need to figure out what those standards should be. And I don't think there are super easy answers there.
Daniel?
I just wanted to ask the same question.
Okay. All right. Okay, Adam and then Henok.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to ask you a question about one of Apple's arguments in the FBI case, and I was wondering if you thought it was somewhat of a red herring when they mentioned the code as speech argument, and what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this, one of Apple's arguments, and this really derives from an argument made by the Electronic Frontier Foundation several years ago in a case called the Bernstein case, which I encourage people to read because it was a federal court case that determined that for this guy Bernstein, who was a PhD student at Berkeley, he published cryptographic code, basically, and the government tried to censor that and tried to deny the right to publish that code. And the court said, well, his publication of that code is an act of freedom of expression, that it's protected by the First Amendment, and that the writing of code itself is First Amendment protected. So Apple, in the FBI case, I think, and you have to go back to what the FBI was actually asking for and what the court ordered, right? So the court, in its preliminary order, said that Apple needed to provide the FBI with a tool in order to access this particular phone, right? So it was asking Apple, was it wasn't really asking, it was a court, it was commanding Apple to write code to enable access to the phone. And Apple's response was, well, you can't compel me to speak. There's a First Amendment protection against compelled speech. So I've only explained your question. I haven't actually answered it.
Well, I guess my concern is there's sort of an ambiguity because there's a lot of concern in granting corporations First Amendment rights in terms of Citizens United, but this seems to be an example where granting them First Amendment rights would be a positive. So on balance, what is your position on corporations obtaining these rights? Is that something human rights activists should be pursuing, or is that more of a threat? Sorry, I didn't make that clear.
No, that's, it's clear, and I was just halfway through anyway. So there's two different issues, right? One is code speech. I think it is. I mean, it's clear, or at least it's expression. Whether it's protected expression is another question. I think you need to go, if we're talking about Article 19, which here we are, you have to ask, can it be restricted under paragraph 3 of Article 19, right? So is it necessary in order to protect national security to compel Apple to write this speech? And I think that's an analysis we need to take. I don't think it was in that case. I don't think the government proved necessity there, but the clear question in that case is it necessary to compel Apple to write this, to express itself in this way? So then the second part of the question, as you note, is does this apply to a corporation? I think that, look, we talk a lot in freedom of expression grounds about the rights of NGOs, which are essentially corporate. I mean, they're not private in the same way, but they're collections of individuals much in the same way that corporations are collections of individuals. And I think you need to look at each case on its own merits. So the Citizens United case, for example, I think was a mistaken conclusion, even if fundamentally you agree that corporations have expression rights. The question is, the extent to which they can be restricted, and I think the Supreme Court in that case got it wrong because limited restrictions were certainly justifiable under Article 19 or under the First Amendment. I think if you're asking just the general question whether corporations have rights to expression, I think that they do. But going beyond that and looking at corporate rights across the board, it varies from right to right as to what kind of right they actually enjoy.
Thank you. I'm Henok, and my thesis is on freedom of expression, and my supervisor is Professor Sejal, and also I took freedom of expression course with Professor Sejal. So I do have 3 questions. The first one is, national security is a legitimate interest to restrict freedom of expression, but some countries do have different standards. Some make incitement to, like terrorism, maybe a legitimate, can lead to restrict freedom of expression. Others say that encouragement and mere inducement can be a reason to restrict freedom of expression. So my question is there any standard in the UN that favors incitement and that disfavors encouragement and inducement? Because my country, the standard in my country is in Ethiopia, which is direct and indirect encouragement, and other inducement of terrorism can be a reason to prosecute journalists or other peoples. My second question is with regard to Facebook posts. Digital age is a blessing for freedom of expression to blossom, of course, but some authoritarian regimes are prosecuting people who, because of what they post on Facebook. So do you think that a person who do have less than 5,000 friends on Facebook, who are scattered in different parts of the country, can incite terrorism because of a certain piece of Facebook posts, because there are also incidents in Ethiopia that journalists are persecuted because of what they post on Facebook. My third question is, I don't remember, a certain professor a month ago came here and said that freedom of expression encompasses two distinct rights, which is, the first one is the right to hear, and the second one is the right to speak. And he was arguing that these two rights are distinct rights, and he was arguing that the right to hear stands by itself. Of course, there is a development in the ECHR that the right to freedom of access to freedom of information is encompassed under freedom of expression, and in the inter-American jurisprudence, such access to information, or it is a public dimension of freedom of expression. But he was arguing that the right to hear is a distinct right, which is under, of course, freedom of expression, but it stands as a distinct right. So what is your view with regard to this right to hear? So thank you very much.
Great, thanks for those questions. I'll take the last one, the third one first. I don't think that they're easily indivisible, actually. So Article 19 protects everyone's right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, right? So it clearly does separate out, by commas, seek, receive, and impart, but you can't have one without the other, right? So my right to impart information also implies an audience, right? It implies your right to hear it in a way. So I don't think it's easy. I mean, conceptually, of course, you can talk about my right to access information and my right to hear, which is to receive information. But I think that in practice, those things go together, right? And it's important as a kind of an underlying policy for what the freedom of expression stands for, right? Because we protect a journalist who has the right to impart information, right? In part, we protect the journalist because of our right to receive the information. So those things are so closely connected that I think even if you can separate them out conceptually, in practice, the rationales behind them are just too closely connected to separate them out.
But for instance, if you are a journalist and if your right to speak is restricted, so can I say that I do have the right to hear your information or your idea, and can go to the court saying that my right to hear is already infringed by the government?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I followed that.
I mean, if your right to freedom of expression is restricted,
yeah.
So can I say that because of that restriction, my right to hear is violated?
Oh, I see.
Go to
I
the
see what you're
court?
saying. Sure. Well, I mean, look, it depends on different standing. I mean, that's actually a standing question as much as anything else. But you can demonstrate a harm in that situation, right? You can demonstrate that the restriction on this person is actually interfering with your independent right. I think that's fair. But it depends on your jurisdiction as to whether you'll be able to raise that claim. But under Article 19, I don't see why not. I mean, those kinds of claims are raised all the time in terms of access to information questions. In terms of your two other questions, so in national security, encouragement and inducement, again, I mean, as I mentioned in my prepared remarks, we need to be forcing governments, when they're restricting expression on the grounds of national security, to demonstrate the necessity of doing so. So I don't think it's enough to use terms like inducement or encouragement as sort of the grounds for a restriction, right? We need to be forcing governments to say, in a particular situation, right, did particular expression actually incite violence or hatred, as provided separately under Article 20. So I think there's a risk at using these broad categories in order to restrict expression when, in fact, we need to be demanding that governments be very clear about their grounds for restriction and actually prove that the restriction is necessary and proportionate. in every situation. So, I'm frankly concerned about terms like encouragement and inducement because they are so broad and they need to be just very clearly specified in law. On your second question, Facebook posts, and the way you framed it was interesting, right? If you have less than 5,000 followers, I mean, I have far less than 5,000 followers. So, does that somehow play into your ability to incite terrorism? I think that was sort of part of so would a Facebook post be capable of inciting terrorism? Is that's kind of the nature of your question? And again, I mean, I think you need to look at the specific elements. It's like the general law on incitement where it's critical to assess both the language that's used by the person expressing something that you might define as inciting, and you have to judge the environment and the audience, right, in which it's made. It's a context-dependent analysis. And so I think it's really impossible to say in the abstract that somebody's post that you might think is inciting violence on Facebook is in fact doing that. It really depends on a specific assessment of that particular context, that environment.
Hi, my name is Paul McIntosh. I'm a writer, journalist, and media professional. 2 questions. First, what's your opinion of the right to be forgotten? In the recent introduction of that, to what extent was the public interest debate even considered, and if not, why not? And the second broader question is about obscenity law and sexual freedom of expression, because this not only appears to me, but at least in the UK context, has recently been used as a validation for regulation without legislation and without discussion. And this is also obviously worldwide a tool for repressing sexual freedom of expression, sexual minorities such as the LGBT community in the USSR, and it seems to be one that is most widely shared and accepted and least challenged worldwide, including in Western societies. So please, your views.
So thanks for those questions. So on the first, the right to be forgotten, I think that the European Court of Justice, when it adopted, in Google Spain, when it adopted this right of erasure, it didn't account for public interest. Certainly didn't account for it sufficiently. So I think we really, now, to a certain extent, it's limited, right? It's in terms of the decision itself in Europe, right? It was limited to search engines and the delisting and delinking and the de-indexing, right, of particular links. So, to a certain extent, it's kind of a narrow decision, right? It only applies in the context of search. It's actually it seems like it's taking on a life of its own around the world and is expanding beyond search. So that's one of the risks. But I think the fundamental risk is that it doesn't have a public interest value at its core. And so we end up in a situation where individuals will seek, and we're already seeing this, individuals will seek to have information about them delinked from search engines, and you end up with kind of 2 different kinds of threats. So one is the threat that public figures seek that and succeed. I mean, they're not always succeeding, but clearly public figures want to sanitize their online footprint. So that's one risk. The other is that sort of from a perspective of social history and just history and access to information more generally, we're losing some context and some information about our world. So I think right to be forgotten is, well, it's troubling. I disagree with the outcome in Google Spain. I mean, I think that to the extent it can be cabined to search and not have kind of broad global reach. I mean, that's my hope. I mean, the other side of it, of course, is a privacy side, and I think that we need to recognize at the same time that the internet, I mean, the digital age, has opened us up to all sorts of privacy restrictions or privacy interferences that really Right to Be Forgotten is attempting to address, and those are real. But I think the Right to Be Forgotten is just so subject to potential abuse that the risks are too great to freedom of expression. So on the issue of obscenity, I think you're right completely that, well, so to step back for a minute, restrictions on freedom of expression are, I've talked about them in the context of national security, public order, and rights and reputations of others. And the one that I didn't mention is public morals, which is, I've always felt, a kind of unfortunate permissible restriction, let's say, because public morals is such a broadly open-ended concept. The Human Rights Committee of the ICCPR and my predecessor, Frank LaRue, have really tried to be clear that, that public morals can only be applied as a restriction where that public moral is something common in the particular community across all traditions. And the problem with obscenity is that there's just enormous variation among communities, even within one society, as to what constitutes obscenity. And for the very reason that you mentioned, I think that its use, right, the use of obscenity rules to limit expression is hitting hard, in particular, those who are seeking to understand their own sexual identity. And that's hitting LGBT groups in particular, particularly hard. It gives I wouldn't say it gives motivation, but it gives a little bit of support to the increase in what are known basically as anti-gay propaganda laws that we've seen in Russia and Kyrgyzstan and Uganda, I mean, across Africa, many other places. And they're rooted in this public morals exception and obscenity. So I think that the rules, as a matter of international law, are fairly clear, but the language of Article 19 is so, capacious that it's like a truck running through this loophole, unfortunately.
Yeah, hand over there.
Thanks. Hi. Hi. Marco Prelitz. I'm a professor at the School of Public Policy.
Hi, Marco.
Hi, Dave. My question is, can a state permit free expression but make the enjoyment of other rights contingent on expressing or not expressing certain classes of views? And the question is prompted by a comment that President Obama recently made in a town hall that turned on the right to bear arms. He mentioned how frustrating it was to receive briefings about people who were fans of the Islamic State and be unable to take measures to restrict their ability to buy weapons. Mm-hmm. Now, that's a particularly American issue, but it seems to me that common sense suggests you would want to be able to prevent somebody who is a fan of the Islamic State, while it's still legal to be that, from having access to large quantities of weapons. It's not clear how one would go about doing that legally. Mm-hmm. And you could probably extend it to other rights as well. Right against discrimination in employment, right to free travel, etc. So if you could address that.
That's a great question. I think as a general matter, law has to be generally applicable across categories, right? And I think one of the fundamental rules of freedom of expression is against content discrimination. And so, I mean, I think in those kinds of situations, whether we're talking about terrorism or criminal behavior or other, similar kinds of behaviors, that in order to restrict access to what's otherwise a public good, it needs to be generally applicable, and it needs to be focused, if we're talking about, ultimately using a different mechanism in order to restrict expression, that it needs to be based on those principles of necessity and proportionality. So I think that a rule that said, if you support ISIS, you can't have access to a gun. I mean, this is obviously crazy because we're talking about access to weapons, which is out of control, but still, that kind of rule would run afoul of freedom of expression. And it needs to be more clearly related to a specific threat that a person poses. That would be my approach to a question like that you can't base it on the particular content of a person's opinion, but it has to be more relevant to sort of the action that they would take. I hope that's responsive.
Hi, I just have a question. I'm just wondering, is part of your work or any of your predecessors or the work of the UN that used the right to receive information in Article 19 to promote transparency in governance, even before citizens explicitly ask for those information? In other words, the obligation to publicize information on the part of the government. I'm not sure if there's any standard like that. Thank you.
There's a lot of work around the issue of, generally of access to information and the importance of governments being transparent, and not just, in the context of freedom of information requests, but also in the context of what governments should be open to providing as an automatic matter, right? As a matter of general transparency. And there have been a couple of reports on access to information by my predecessors, which they're pretty easy to find on the OHCHR. Well, actually, nothing is easy to find on the OHCHR website, but if you go to the page of the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression, you'll find them listed under thematic reports, and they're there. But there's clearly, there's clearly a norm in Article 19 that extends to kind of proactive publication that encourages governments not merely to be responsive, but to be more direct and open and sort of transparently opening themselves up to information.
Thanks. Very quick one. Valentina Azarova. I'm a research fellow here, but I spent about 10 years in Palestine. The recent anti-BDS boycott, divestment, sanctions legislation, what should we make of it under freedom of expression standards in international law? And maybe, given the California example that's still in the making, what's the logic of these attacks, essentially? Beyond the politics in it, the restriction of public procurers, also companies, from being able to say we will not engage in business relations with other companies that are involved in certain violations of international law. So as a form of freedom of expression, but also as a form of choice and beyond the consumers. It goes back to the question of whether businesses have rights in that respect, and whether governments should protect the right of essentially enforcing international law to some extent, and not becoming complicit or enjoying, benefiting from violations.
So I think, the BDS issue, there's so many different things going on in it. Right, so one is the divestment specific question, which, sure, there are freedom of expression issues embedded there. Certainly, on college campuses, but also when it comes to different kinds of public investment portfolios. I mean, everybody who's a part of that system has the right, to protest against, to protest in favor of divestment. I mean, I don't think there's a question there. I find there's one troubling aspect of the BDS effort, which to my mind is focused on academic divestment, if you want to call it that. And for me, that raises a concern, in part based on the facts, but it's also based on Article 19, which protects the right to seek, receive, and impart information regardless of frontiers. And I think that academic freedom is particularly under threat around the world, and we should be looking for ways to foster academic freedom, even in institutions that are rooted in countries or in systems that we find distasteful. And in part, that's a practical reason, because I think that there's real value in engaging with academics. And here, to be more concrete, Israeli academics in places, in universities of places of higher education in Israel, where I think that's actually the strongest support for anti-occupation. I mean, there's not much left in Israel, to be sure, but I mean, if it exists, it's on college campuses, universities. So I think that on the facts, that's a problem, but on the law, I think that there's a restriction on the flow of academic information that is pretty troubling. So that doesn't really answer your question about the divestment issues, but of course, on divestment, when it comes to public funding, every funder is able to decide where to put its money, and if it decides to remove it from Israeli funds, that's its prerogative. I don't think there are freedom of expression issues there, but I think it's their prerogative to be able to do that.
I have just two more questions. Nehal, you had your hand raised earlier.
Hello, I'm Nehal Hirani. I also took the course with Professor Sejal for Freedom of Expression. My question is to do with something you said yesterday about you would appreciate people reporting, or individuals reporting about the situation, and NGOs. My question is, how do you prioritize which message or which issue is more serious? Or suppose recently in Uganda, they just cut off all social media for 2 days. And yesterday, while we were sitting at the conference, one of my former colleagues in Malaysia got arrested. So if you get sorry to give you more context, for selling T-shirts with the face of a clown of the Prime Minister of Malaysia currently. So it was more of an artistic expression. But how do you go about it, and what are the immediate steps that you would take once you receive this information? Yeah.
Okay, so that's a really great practical question. So just to give a little more context, so I receive, hundreds of communications a year from individuals like your friend in Malaysia, who are alleging a violation of freedom of expression, of their particular freedom of expression. And in response, we issue allegation letters or urgent appeals directly to governments. And those can be very short. They're almost like demand letters. But they're short, they're general, they're asking questions of the government, right? So here's the allegation. We're not drawing any conclusion from it. But what's your response to it? Are these facts that have come to our attention, are they true? And how do you justify this behavior if they are true? I mean, basically we do that. How do you justify it under Article 19? Our problem is one of capacity more than anything else. So, if you're a funder here, let's talk afterwards, because, the UN, like all international institutions, simply lacks the capacity to address all of these different communications that we get. And we typically are in the range of 300 communications that we issue every year. So our ability to prioritize, I would say that we tend to prioritize those issues of individuals who are subject to detention, everything from detention to, capital punishment. Like those kinds of things where there's an urgent need for us to reach out to the government and occasionally go public. I mean, those are obviously the most important because they're time-bound issues. But the range of other issues out there, I mean, sometimes we need to prioritize legislation, because if we don't provide our input, it'll become law, and the restriction could become a part of law without our being able to intervene.
Yeah.
But we don't have any strict rules, right, of what gets ranked above others. But those are the main factors. It's kind of a timeliness factor. I mean, it's not like there is an element of gravity to them as well, but it's not scientific. It's more like, what's the time sensitivity of our issue.
Nobody will be interested in.
I think that it sounds like we're getting interference here.
Hi, David. I just want to address kind of old new issue, contempt of court and freedom of expression at this stage, because my limited research suggests that there are not much development in the international level last, let's say that 20 years or 2 decades. And also we are observing that fragmented international or supranational tribunals are developing. There are contempt of court issues coming, not only in South Asia, but also within the international level. So, and also in the digital context as well. So, are you thinking about something in relation to the freedom of expression and contempt of court? Because this is a very new, old issue, I understood. But at the same time, it's kind of coming up in a very new way and new forms as we are observing. So what's your take on it?
Wait, just so I understand, freedom of expression in the context of courts, you started with
yes,
contempt kind of proceedings?
Yes, right.
Contempt comes up, I mean, if we're talking specifically about contempt, it comes up in all sorts of situations. Actually, I'm reminded of an ICTY issue that was pretty public, 2 months ago at the sentencing of Radovan Karadzic. At the time that he was sentenced, Florence Hartmann, a journalist who formerly was a spokesperson for the chief prosecutor of the ICTY, she had written a book, and the allegation was that she published information that was under seal, essentially confidential information. I mean, it's a long story, which I won't get into, but at the end of the day, she was held in contempt of court for publishing in violation of ICTY rules. And I think there you have a very clear competition, right, between the court's need to sort of maintain the rule of law, at least as it sees the rule of law to be understood, in the context of court proceedings, versus the public's right to know. And I mean, I won't draw any conclusions about the contempt case, but it's clear that that's a constant push and pull. But I do think that those kinds of rules, as a matter of kind of general principles across borders, that almost all national courts have those kinds of rules that restrict the publication of information where it's necessary to do so, right, in the context of judicial proceedings. I think the problem is that they're very often subject to abuse, right? So just to give an example, in the very unfortunate case of Tajikistan, the court completely closed proceedings against about 13 or 14 individuals who were leaders of the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan, who were being accused of, extremism, and any attempt to get information or to share information about the cases against these individuals would have been subject to contempt. And that was clearly a violation of the right to a public accounting of charges in a public trial. So, I think there's a real abuse of contempt norms, generally speaking. So they raise, in some circumstances, freedom of expression issues, but they're so rooted in, I think, in customary norms in courts around the world that there's nothing, that contempt rules on their own are not objectionable. I mean, they're a normal part of how courts do their business and how courts in many instances need to do their business. I think more generally, sort of the more general question you mentioned, or the point about fragmentation, is also very real, but it's also really normal, right? Particularly in international law. I mean, there's no supranational court for any of these issues. So as long as courts are adhering to basic standards for our purposes, Article 19, I think, variation and experimentation is a value, but they need to be within the context of respect for Article 19. You can have different outcomes, though.
So, David, thank you very much for your responding to questions in such a thoughtful and reflective manner. If I might, as chair, just ask you the final question, which is about Hungary. You're here on an unofficial visit, yet you've had some small opportunities to talk to people over the last couple of days. What is your view of the protection of freedom of expression in this country, from those small interactions and from what you've seen in the last 2 days?
So it's true, I'm here unofficially. I mean, I'm literally here, but, and so I don't want to get too into the situation in Hungary just because I haven't done, seriously, as a matter of, doing the research and hearing from all sides, I just haven't done that. So I can't really speak too specifically about it. But I would say two things. One is the issue of free media. And again, it's similar. So I was in Japan in April, and the situation there's certain similarities. And one of the similarities is that there's pretty vibrant freedom of expression when it comes to online issues. There's also independent media. The problem is the reach and capacity of the independent media to reach a broader audience. And I think that there may be issues that are similar here around media independence. But again, I caution that these are, that's a kind of initial point. The other point I would make is, Hungary is a member of the European Union, and I guess my hope is that there's greater engagement and greater interaction between Brussels and Budapest, and that there's openness to criticism, there's openness to assessment also by the OSCE and by other institutions to which Hungary is a party, which Hungary is a member. I think that kind of interaction is essential, both for those institutions and for Hungary. So, but I'm sorry, I can't really rise to the bait in a way and be more specific.
Okay, thank you. So perhaps an official visit in forthcoming years. Well, we'll wait and see. So thanks again for a magnificent lecture. You referred to standard bearers and advocates for freedom of expression within the UN human rights system. I think you've already shown that you've got great commitment and both an intellectual rigor and eye for detail, as well as making it personal, which I think is a fantastic message in order to make the case for freedom of expression globally more compelling. So thanks very much, David.